All right, thank you very much. Again, we have Nico Carver. If you missed the vote the first time, we need to go back in time just a little bit. But it hasn't changed much since I read it the first time. And for our next presentation, he will be telling us about telescopes for astrophotography and how to choose the right one for you. Let's welcome Nico.
Thanks again, Bill. And this is a brand new presentation for me. The presentation I've given the most times, I've probably given it 50 times at this point, is called Astrophotography Without a Telescope. So this is the opposite. And it's something I'm excited about because I do really enjoy telescopes, but if you see my YouTube channel, what I became known for was astrophotography with just like a camera lens. And so that's the presentation. When I give people a bunch of choices, they're like, that one, because people know about you from just doing it with a camera lens. So I just do sort of a condensed version of my most popular videos. But I think part of the reason I'm thinking now that I want to branch out from that is because smart telescopes have really changed the amateur scene. And I was just telling Bill this because he asked me, well, if there was a beginner that came up to you and said, well, what should I start with? I have nothing, I have no background in any of this. For a lot of them, I would say this is the smart telescope today. But it really depends on the personality of the person, right? Because there's a lot of people in the hobby, me included, that part of what we like about it is just all of the challenges. And the smart telescope takes away a lot of those challenges. But if you're someone who just sort of likes, being frustrated, but then fixing things because that's part of it for you, then maybe the smart telescope isn't the right choice because it just takes away so much of the pain points while putting things together and trying to get all these different little pieces to work correctly can be fun for some people. So I talked a little bit about my background into this already, but it's just interesting to me that 10, 11 years ago, I never owned a telescope. I am not one of those people where it's like my story is, as a child, I got a telescope as a Christmas present at 5 years old and loved it. I had never owned a telescope before 10 years ago. And never really thought telescopes should be a big part of my life. But now, of course, they are. And I've reviewed so many, and it's crazy to think about. But when I was just getting into astrophotography now 10, 11 years ago, one of the first things that I did after getting back from that Iceland trip was I joined my local astronomy club, which was the Delaware Astronomical Society. And this was more than just getting into astronomy being life-changing. This was life-changing too because it was such an open club, just like this group. There's so many people to meet and people to be mentors in the hobby right away. And they were also so open to sharing things. Like I think it's great that you have the loaner smart telescopes because the Delaware Astronomical Society had a huge loaner collection of gear. So before I had the funds to buy anything, I could start trying out telescopes right away. So I'll go through a little bit of my very early history with telescopes now. One of the first telescopes they let me play with was this one, which is sort of a rare telescope. It's actually something that people now collect because the lens design was by this guy, Roland Christian, who is pretty famous in the amateur telescope community. He's the owner of Astrophysics in Illinois, and so he makes these really high-end telescopes. Before he founded Astrophysics, he was in the industry, and I guess he made this telescope. At the time, I was brand new. I had no idea what any of this meant, but people were telling me, this is a really important telescope, and you can use it. So I was like, oh, cool. So I tried to, and apparently it had just been sitting in a closet, and no one had used it since it was donated in the 90s. And so I got to try it out a little bit. It had a lot of challenges for astrophotography. I don't know how experienced everyone is, but if you look at this sort of telescope, it doesn't look like a modern telescope for astrophotography. There's no place to attach any accessories. The focuser is this sort of strange single speed one that comes way, way out to reach focus. So there's a bunch of little issues with it. And I don't have any actual pictures that I took with it, because I don't remember if I even saved them. But it was a really cool introduction. It was nice to be able to try something that was actually good quality right off the bat. Another thing they had was a 12-inch Newtonian in a little roll-off roof observatory. And again, that's not what I would recommend to a beginner at all. But before I did anything else with like star trackers or anything, I attached my DSLR to this and got some pretty nice pictures. But this led me astray a little bit because I didn't know, I knew enough to be dangerous, but I didn't know really what I was doing. And so I thought, oh, a Newtonian, that would be great. So I'll talk about this in a second here, that like getting that early experience with the Newtonian made me think, well, yeah, to get really cool results like this, yeah, get a Newtonian, and that'll be the answer. But what I didn't realize at the time was that Newtonian was like attached to a really high-end mount, the concrete pier, and all of these things make a huge difference. It's not just the telescope, but this whole kit that really makes the difference. When we get into prices of things, you'll definitely see that. So I talked to the club about like, well, when I buy my first telescope, should it be a Newtonian? Because I really like the results here. And a lot of people told me, no, that's the wrong way to go. And they were right. And the first telescope I bought was a 80 millimeter double. And that's a really nice first telescope to buy. This is a raffle prize, right, Bill?
Yes.
This is an 80 millimeter right here, and this is a really nice telescope to start astrophotography with. It's big enough that you can get really nice detailed images, but it's small enough that you're not going to be just struggling with being undermounted or things like that, because you can put it on almost any kind of equatorial mount and still have an appropriate mount for it. I was using it with my DSLR camera. I'll talk a little bit about this much later, but these are some sort of specs, and it's like starting with something like this, like a big DSLR with big pixels, is that it also makes it a little bit easier. There's some of my early results, and you can see by today's standards, these aren't very good. They're pretty noisy, but I was thrilled with these. And this was with a stock DSLR. So, and this was also before we had dual narrowband filters or any of this. So I was using what's called a CLS filter, which is a city light suppression filter to get sort of the red nebulae to pop up like that. So the gear has gotten much better, but I was still very happy with these early images. But then, very quickly, I thought back to these images, and I was like, oh, well, mine aren't as good as the ones that I was getting with the Newtonian. So I thought, okay, I gotta get a Newtonian. And so I got the biggest Newtonian I could buy, which was an 8-inch imaging Newtonian. And I thought, the bigger telescope, definitely better results, right? No, for 8 months, I didn't get a single image that I liked. And that wasn't for not trying. I was out night after night after night trying to get a good image. And the frustrating thing with a telescope like this is when you're new, you can see that there's something wrong, but you can't necessarily identify what's wrong. And a lot of times the reason for that is there's actually 10 things wrong. Right? So it's not just that it's out of collimation or out of focus or something like that. It's also that your mount isn't stable enough and the wind is hitting that big telescope like a sail and causing your stars to trail. And so you can see, oh, these stars aren't good, I'm not getting good results, but you can't figure out why. And I'd say that's the big danger with thinking, I need to go get a big telescope, is it's so hard to troubleshoot why it's not going right for you. So after 8 months of trying, I finally got one image I sort of liked, which was this one. But of course, I wanted to make it a color image, and I never even got to that step. This is just with the HA filter. But even this image, I was starting to get what's called the pixel peak keeping disease. So this is terrible if you don't develop it. But basically what happens is you look at a whole image like that and you show it to someone and you're like, that's great, what's wrong with it? And then you show them, well, if I zoom in to 200%, look at those stars, those aren't perfectly round. And that doesn't matter in terms of the overall impact of the picture, but it bothers me so much that I can't get beyond it. And I just like, I can't move on. And I can't just like actually keep taking pictures because those stars aren't perfectly round. So after taking this picture, I sold the Newtonian. I decided, you know what, I'm not happy with this. And I went in the exact opposite direction. At this point, I had the black and white mono camera, and I attached it to one of my old DSLR lenses. And with that, I started taking some of my favorite pictures ever, really big nebulae, like the Spaghetti Nebula and stuff like that. And I was so happy to have moved on from the big telescope. So then for years, you know, with my YouTube channel and everything, I never wanted to go back. I don't want to use another Newtonian because it was too scarring an experience for me. But just this year, maybe against my better judgment, I find a company said, well, you're a telescope reviewer, do you want to review a Newtonian? And it was the first company that had reached out to me to review a Newtonian. And so I thought, you know what, if I'm going to try to be an expert in astrophotography, I should try this again. I shouldn't be scared of it. So I did accept the telescope for review. I have not done the review on YouTube yet, but this is it. It's another 8-inch Newtonian, just like the one that gave me 8 months ago. I do have a bunch of advantages now. So if we go way back to what I started with, which was I got so excited with that club Newtonian. I now have all those advantages. I have the really nice premium mount. I have the telescope pier, the concrete pier, and those make the observatory walls to stop the wind. All of those things make this so much easier to use. But even with all those advantages, this took me 2 months and 100 emails to get a good image. And 100 emails back and forth with the guy who designed it, the engineer. And because they're just a lot more difficult, especially if you're just trying to get those stars perfect. But this is just an early sample picture with it. This is an f2.7, so it's a fast Newtonian. So this is only 3 hours of data. And if I was doing this with a refractor like this, it would be like 4 times that, 12 hours to get a picture like this one. So the advantage of these bigger aperture telescopes is once you get them working, which might take 100 hours, then from then on out, once they're actually working in the observatory, then you can get better pictures faster. So it's like a bunch of upfront time, but then once you do all that upfront time, you can do a lot of cool things. Okay, so this was all sort of my history with telescopes, but I want to go into how do you pick a telescope. My background with this, before 2020, I only used 9 telescopes for photography. Since 2020, I've tested 33. Most of them have been refractor type telescopes, which you can think of as just sort of a big camera lens. So camera lens, the only difference between a camera lens and a refractor telescopes is a camera lens is designed to focus a range of focal distances. So I could do a close-up. I could go this close to a chair to take a picture of it, or I could just go up here and redo the autofocus and focus something way over there. With a telescope, it only has one focal distance, infinity, because you're only going to be looking at space with it. Other than that, the exact same concept. It's just a bunch of glass lenses inside a tube that reaches focus back here. And the reason I've tested mostly refractors is 1, because of my past experience being scared of mirrors, but then 2, once you start doing something on YouTube, then companies are like, well, I want to see more of that. So they're all been sending me refractor telescopes. Okay, and then I thought about this a lot for this presentation and tried to come up with the factors that I think are important for anyone in picking a telescope. And so here's what I came up with. It's 6 factors, but I would put these primary factors as way, way more important than these ones. So the primary factors to me are field of view. That's just, we'll talk more about these in detail, but just how much of the sky your telescope is capturing with your camera. Money, because like most of us are on some kind of budget. So you have to think about how much the telescope actually costs, but then you also have to think about, is this telescope appropriate with the kit, and how much is that kit going to cost to support the telescope that I want to buy? And what I found is that usually when you put together the whole kit, the telescope shouldn't be one of the most important parts of it. A lot of times you spend more on the mount and the camera than the telescope and get better results that way. And then difficulty levels. So I've already sort of talked about this, but trying to find the right telescope for you at your sort of part of the path into astrophotography, I think that's really important too. If you try a telescope that's way too difficult for you too early, you can, like, I kept going, but some people might just be like, I'm done with astrophotography. I don't like it anymore after trying this really difficult telescope. And then secondary factors, I'll just talk about these more as we get to them, but they're more about like the technical details, the stuff that I would actually cover in reviews. And one thing I worry about with all the reviews I do on YouTube is because I cover these, because they're the main differentiator between different telescopes, that people think these are the most important factors. But actually the most important factors are about you and where you are in the journey and how much money you have to spend on it and these kind of things. So, okay, let's start with field of view. So to define field of view, let's start with the widest field of view you could get. So if you just lay down on the ground and are in the entire night sky, you have a 180-degree field of view, right? If you think of it's like half of a dome, or it's a dome, sorry, it's half of a full sphere, that's 180 degrees. And this is, of course, taken with a fisheye lens. If you want this kind of image, you can get what's called a solar fisheye lens, and it takes in the full sky, 180 degrees. Most of the time, though, when we're doing astrophotography, we're way, way more zoomed in on the sky. So here's a 180-degree field of view. This is at an 8mm focal length. You get the entire night sky. This little yellow box right there, that's this picture on the right. And that's a 3-degree field of view. So, and what this degrees means is basically just that if you break up from this horizon to this horizon, you're breaking up into 180 parts. From here to here, that's just 3 degrees, that's 3 parts. So it's just a way of defining the sky. You can think of it as sort of angles, right? So if you have 3 degrees, you can break those up even further into arc minutes and arc seconds, degrees of arc. Okay, we can go in even further. This is just zooming in further. And so we've gone from 3 degrees with a 200mm focal length lens here, and now this yellow box is just under a degree, so 0.7 degrees across, and that's at 500mm. Now you could still do 500mm with a camera lens, but usually when we get to 500mm, you're using a telescope, because a telescope has a lot of advantages over a camera lens at 500mm. You'll get sharper stars from corner to corner if you use a telescope rather than a camera lens. And the camera lens at 500mm, to get something this good, you're probably going to spend a lot more unnecessarily. Okay, the reason I'm bringing all this up with field of view is that what you are capturing and what you're interested in, the field of view is what's most important. So if you're interested in what are called planetary nebulae, these really small, compact nebulae in the sky that are often, the reason they're often called planetary nebulae is they're quite small and sometimes bright. They're the dying star, and as the star sort of expels all its gases like that. You need a much bigger telescope because your field of view is going to be much smaller. If you try to capture a planetary nebula like this Cat Nebula with a small telescope, it's that. It basically just looks like another star, and you don't get a very impressive photo of it because your field of view is so much different. That small detail doesn't come across. Okay, so there's the size of the Cat's Eye Nebula with a much smaller telescope. But let's go to a different example. There's lots of objects in the night sky, like this blue Horsehead Nebula that is huge. It takes up, do I have it here in my notes? Something like 4 or 5 degrees across. And so for that, a wide field telescope like the Red Cat at 250 millimeter focal length is going to be the much better choice. If we try to do it with this big telescope and the field of view is much narrower, this is all you would see. Because you're only seeing, oh, I don't know, I gotta go to the box there. That little yellow box on this side, right? So you're only seeing a little bit of the reflection nebula and you don't get the whole impact of that blue Horsehead. So it's not that bigger telescopes are always better. It's that you have to think about, what am I trying to capture? And a lot of times, when I'm talking to people, they say, well, I don't want to get a small telescope because there's only like 4 things I can capture. Not at all. There's hundreds of scenes that you can capture with a small telescope, especially once you get into the filters and things like that. Because emission nebulae are often giant, like 10 times the size of the full moon. If you put 10 full moons across in the sky, that's the size of a certain emission nebula. And there's a bunch of those. Many of them are not super well known because they're so dim, they're only available photographically. So even if you talk to other visual observers, they could be like, what are you talking about? I've never heard of that nebula before, because they can't see it through the eyepiece. You can only photograph it. And so it's a very interesting thing. You can do so much with a small telescope with the right gear. You don't necessarily need a big telescope. But how do you figure this out before when you go to buy a telescope, you're thinking, well, what's actually going to work with my camera? Because that's the other thing. There's a bunch of different camera sensor sizes. So these examples are with a particular sensor size inside the camera. But if you look at astronomy cameras today, you'll notice that some of them are like big as my thumbnail, right? While some of them are 10 times as big. They're bigger sensors. And that will really change your field of view as well. So what I recommend is you want to visualize what your telescope and camera sensor combination is going to look like before you buy the telescope. And then visualize that on a bunch of objects that you're interested in capturing. So in this case, it's the Horsehead and Flame Nebula. And with this tool, which is appropriately named Blackwater Skies, you can make these different boxes, these overlays, with different combinations of gear. So I can put it in, I can use, like, let's say I already have the camera. So I put in the camera, and then I'm looking at different telescopes I might want to buy. And these overlays will be the different fields of view with different telescopes. So this would obviously be, the smaller box would be a telescope with longer focal length, probably a bigger telescope, and the green box would be one with a wider focal length, so a smaller telescope. And you can go around and check out different objects this way and sort of see how they're going to fit. Because another thing that people often find surprising is, like, let's say you want to fit the entire Andromeda galaxy in one picture. You get a big telescope and that it's too big. It'll be cut off. And you can get into what's called mosaic imaging, but that's a little bit difficult. And that actually might be a next slide. Yes. Okay, so a common tip that you'll hear when you go online and people say, well, what kind of telescope should I get? A lot of times the first thing people will say was, well, figure out your pixel scale. So that's how much of the sky fits onto one pixel on your camera. I don't agree with that advice. I don't think that should be the first thing you should think about. I think you should think about how much of the sky fits on your entire sensor, not how much fits onto one pixel. Because what do you really care about? What the overall picture looks like, or how much sky fits onto one pixel? And so I tell people, field of view is more important than pixel size. Here's a couple of reasons why I think that. Okay, if your field of view is too large for what you're trying to do, you can crop in, right? You can crop away pixels. But if you're doing that all the time, you want to do something like printed, when you crop in, you're losing lots of resolution. So if you've picked a field of view that's way too large for what you want to do, then you try to do something like pan or zoom in on your image, and it gets all pixelated. If your field of view is too small, and you can't fit in the object, you really want to shoot the Andromeda Galaxy, but it doesn't fit onto your camera sensor with the telescope you bought. You can then mosaic, so you can take tiles and put them together. But for a beginner, mosaicing is really hard, unless you have something like a smart telescope. If you're trying to do it just on your own, it can be really difficult because you have to get the rotation angle just right, and you have to do all this stuff with software. So mosaics are really difficult typically. So getting your field of view right, not too large and not too small, I think is really important. With pixel size though, if you're undersampled, meaning your pixel size is too generous, meaning you're putting too much sky into each pixel, you can do something called drizzling, which works quite well. And if you're oversampled, you can use what's called deconvolution, and that works really well too. So I don't think that over-undersampling, which if you're not familiar with the terms, if you look stuff up online, you'll often see these, are as big a deal as getting your field of view wrong. I think anywhere from 0.3 arcseconds per pixel to, there's no limit for undersampling. It can work well. So I wouldn't be afraid of small telescopes just because people say you're undersampled. As long as you like the amount of sky you're picking up, your field of view, I think you'll be happy with a small telescope. Okay, and then the other reason sometimes a small telescope is the right choice is because the overall kit and how much you're going to spend on it. Because if you get the big telescope, you're going to have to spend way more on this, on the mount. And possibly more on what goes around the mount, some kind of wind protection or other things like that. Okay, so as an example of like an overall kit price, the telescope in this case, I think I have it in my car, but I forgot to bring it in, barely looks like a telescope. This is the whole telescope right here. It's called the ASCAR FMA 180. So it's 180 millimeter focal length, so like a camera lens. But it's capable of really, really good device, really, really good results. And it only costs $430. But the cheapest equatorial mount you're going to want for imaging, this is called the Skywatcher Star Adventure GTI, is $800. So this is another thing that I think beginners often don't realize, is that they'll often spend more on the thing that holds the telescope than the telescope itself. And that's completely normal if your main interest is astrophotography. With visual astronomy, that's usually not the case. You can get a $100 alt-az mount and a $2,000 telescope, and that combination might work. But for astrophotography, it's flipped. Usually you spend at least double on the mount than you would on the telescope. And then there's other stuff to consider. To make the mount more accurate, you have what's called guiding. That costs some money. To get this kind of colorful result on an emission nebula, especially if you're not imaging from dark skies, you're going to want what's called a dual narrowband filter, and all these little things will add up. So when you're thinking about buying a telescope, you really want to be thinking about the entire kit, not just the telescope itself. I just have a couple other examples of kits here. Here's another one. In this case, I spent barely more on the mount or the telescope and the filter. Those are all the same. But in this case, I spent a lot more on the camera and the software. And so this is another thing to keep in mind is this is a telescope I just reviewed on YouTube. And the telescope had some problems, but when I used the filter and some software, a lot of those problems can be fixed. And the overall image can still be really nice in the end because of the use of the filter and the specialized software that you using to process it. Okay, and then what's so cool about the smart telescope is that's the whole kit, right? $400 all in. It has the autofocuser, it has the tracking, it has everything built into that for $400. So that's why those are instantly so popular, because Because once you start researching this stuff, you realize, oh, a whole deep sky astrophotography kit to start taking pictures of nebulae, I'm looking at $2,000 minimum, probably $3,000, $4,000. You start, the costs really add up. Well, this is the whole thing, and it can do solar, it can do lunar, it can do deep sky. So there's certain limitations to it, of course, but as an entry point, it's really, really good. And I would say it's by far the easiest. So that's the last primary factor I would think about when picking a telescope is where are you on this journey of astrophotography? And I would not start with the most difficult option. Just for your own peace of mind, start with something easier and then ease your way into the hobby. And you can always upgrade to bigger telescopes. But generally, bigger telescopes and telescopes with mirrors are harder for astrophotography than camera lenses, refractors, and smart telescopes, trying to be easier. Now, there's two telescope types there that I put a question mark of where to put them, Schmidt Cassegrates and Ritchie Crichtons, because I haven't used either for astrophotography. But I've often been next to someone using one and hearing them trying to fix it and collimate it and avoid mirror flop and all these different things that can go wrong with those. So I feel like they're probably more on the more difficult end. Okay, and then I'll just quickly go through the secondary factors. So, like I said, a lot of these secondary factors, where I would go to find out about these is YouTube. You know, my YouTube channel, I do a lot of reviews, but there's a lot of other good telescope reviewers too. And this is something we can cover well because we do these in-depth tests of the telescopes. And what these can tell you are things like, well, if I use this telescope with this particular field corrector, how do the stars look and things like that. It's not something I'd be super concerned about as a beginner, but when you're spending a lot of money on a telescope, it's probably something you might want to know ahead of time. So looking at those reviews can tell you, well, what do the stars look like in the corners? Are they round? Do they have any little weird artifacts? So this is a review I just published yesterday, and this these are new $400 telescopes. And I found, you know, the ASCAR AED had these little, they call it aperture vignettes, these little lights out of the star, the bright stars towards the edge. Well, this one, Bony, which is another $400 telescope, I don't know if you can see it here, but its problem was it had a little bit of purple bloat around the bright stars, and that's another common problem. It just means that its glass types aren't able to control that sort of deep blue violet light well enough to keep it all focused correctly. But a lot of these issues you can fix in processing, or maybe they're not a big deal to you, so spending less and just having some compromises with your telescope is often fine. You know, trying to get to that perfect telescope, it's you know, you're either going to spend a lot of money, but even if you spend a lot of money, I talked to lots of people who spend all the money and they're still not happy because maybe they think just spending the money is all they have to do. Well, there's a lot of skills you have to develop, right? It's not just about spending the money on the telescope. Okay, and then this isn't great for a presentation because it's way too technical, I think, but these are all related terms, right? So the size of your telescope and the size of your pixels in your camera sensor get you to what's called pixel scaling. And this is where we get the undersampling, oversampling stuff. And a lot of times people will say, well, aim for something around here, around 1 arc second per pixel, or maybe 1 to 2 arc seconds per pixel. And the reason for that is then you know that you're using the full resolution of your telescope, basically. If you are way undersampled, your telescope could theoretically resolve finer details. So if this is something you're really interested in, you'll want to look up this topic. Like, if really what you want is just for your telescope to resolve the finest details, and this can get really important for imaging the planets and things where they're really small in the sky, this is what you want to read up. For me, since I mostly like these big, soft clouds of dust called nebulae, I really don't care about this that much. I care about the field of view, what I can fit on my sensor. I'm not someone really cares, oh, is this detail the sharpest it could be? But that's where this gets interesting. And the difference between these two terms, pixel scale and Dawes limit, is the Dawes limit is just based on this opening, just based on the aperture of your telescope. What's the smallest detail this telescope could possibly resolve? And so for an 8-inch telescope, it would be 0.57 arc seconds, so a very small detail. And generally, you don't want your pixel scale to be below the Dawes limit, because then you're just throwing data. You're basically saying that I'm trying to sample something that my telescope can't actually resolve. I'm trying to find a detail there that I'm never going to be able to get. It gets even more complicated because it also depends on the atmosphere, right? So most of us don't live on a mountain top where we're way above many layers of atmosphere, where we have excellent seeing. So the atmosphere will also blur the smallest details. And so this is another reason why a lot of times people say, well, getting under sub-arc second per pixel isn't super important because on most nights, you're not going to be able to resolve that because the atmosphere will blur those smaller details, especially with long exposure deep sky astrophotography, where all of that blur is baked in because over 5 minutes of an exposure, all the atmosphere layers are going to be going faster than it. You'd have to go much shorter exposures to try to beat all of that turbulence in the atmosphere. Okay, the last secondary factor, and this is something where it's really hard to know as a beginner what your personal deal breakers are going to be. And I can't predict them either. Because I talk to people all the time and they tell me, well, I hate this telescope because of X and Y, and for me, those don't matter at all. But there's little things that can really bother you about a telescope. And so another reason to maybe watch reviews is I try to cover a lot of different little things about the mechanics of the telescope, and maybe you'll see something in there that'll be like, oh yeah, that would really bother me. But for someone else, it doesn't bother them at all. For me, something that is a personal deal breaker is a lot of telescopes don't have what's called a rotator or a camera angle adjuster. And I sort of see astrophotography as this art where I'm trying to frame up a certain thing in the night sky just how I want it to look. And so if I can't rotate my camera relative to the night sky, it really annoys me. And so I really enjoy when telescopes have a really accurate, finely tuned rotator or camera angle adjuster that lets me rotate the camera independently from the telescope. All right, and I think that's it for this one, so I'm happy to answer questions. Yeah.
So sometimes people will ask you what's the best telescope, and they really don't know what they want to do. You say, what do you want to do? And they want to do everything. And you try to explain to them that there is not a telescope that will give you everything. And what I tell them is, okay, when did you buy your last perfect car? And then that kind of gets the point across. There isn't a perfect car, there isn't a perfect telescope.
Yep.
So that's a good way to try to explain to people that, and once you get it, then they think, oh, I understand. So you've got to decide what you want to do and then get the telescope. And sometimes that gets the point across because they'll tell you their last car they bought wasn't perfect or they never buy a perfect car.
Yes.
So that's one of the things that I tell people if they ask.
Yeah, that's great. The comment was that if someone asks, what's the perfect telescope, let's say, well, what was the last time you had a perfect car? And then there is, perfection is impossible to attain because there's so many different factors that goes into it. The other sort of wrinkle on that, people often say is, well, I want a telescope that I can look at through the eyepiece and then just quickly put a camera on it and all of that's going to work. And I'm like, the people have been trying to do something like that forever. It's never worked as well as you think it would. Once you got your camera and all your stuff on your telescope, a lot of times people will think, well, yeah, I'll just quickly take all of this off and put the eyepiece on. You're not going to want to do that. You have this set up for imaging. You're not going to want to quickly switch between that and visual. What you're really wanting to do is have one telescope and whole kit here set up for photography, and then have a completely different telescope for visual. And since I'm not huge into visual, my kit for visual is just binoculars. I set up all my astrophotography gear, and then I have a $50 pair of binoculars, and I just sit back and I like looking at things with my binoculars. And it's easy, and I enjoy it, especially from a dark sky where I can see the shape of bright nebulae, I can see the star clusters. Just really, it basically just feels like an extension of your eyes. Like your eyes just get a little bit bigger with the binoculars, and I really enjoy that. Yeah.
So you went through focal length, which is very, very important. One of the things, the kit I recommend for somebody that's decided they want to move to a refractor telescope and try astrophotography, there's a modular system on it. And this is made by Astrophotography. It's called the Astrophotography. With that kit, it's packaged a 60 millimeter front end and an 80 millimeter front end. Just screw one off, screw that one on. And then on the rear side, we have 3 different attachments. You have a reducer, you have a flattener, and you have an extender. So between the different combinations of that kit, you can have one telescope and go from 270 millimeters all the way to 600. You'll have 6 different focal lengths that you can shoot. It's very versatile. It's what I use for travel, and we'll bring it today. And then also, if for occasion, which I agree 100%, once you're set up for astrophotography, you don't want to take things off and put on a visual back. But it also comes with a visual back. So it is essentially 7 telescopes in one for that kit. And it's very versatile. I bought mine before, and it's right now we're on sale, and it's half off. So it's under $1,000, and you can pick that.
Yeah, that's a great point, Bill. And when I was showing the 2 example kits here, both this telescope and this telescope have the corrector elements built into them. So that's the total price of the telescope. But you'll definitely want to make sure that if your telescope is like a doublet or a triplet, that you also budget in the field corrector. With the ASCAR-V, it comes with all of those in the kit. So they know you're going to want to do imaging with this, so it comes with all the reducers and extenders and things you want. But normally, you might just buy a telescope and think, okay, I have a telescope, now I'm just going to attach the camera to it. When you attach the camera to it, you see that only the center is sharp and all of the rest is all blurry and the stars are elongated, and that's because you didn't also get what's called a field flattener. And so with visual, we're just looking to the eyepiece. We're basically just looking at the very center of the optics. But with a camera, you're getting much more of what's called the image circle of the telescope. And so you typically need some kind of field corrector unless it's built into the telescope. When it's built into the telescope, they'll often call it an astrograph because they know that this is the kind of telescope that imagers want. That if you're doing photography, you might want all that correction already built in. If it's a telescope that's more designed, like Bill was talking about, where it can do visual and astrophotography, then those field correctors are separate, and you screw them on when you're doing photography. And you don't use them typically when you put on the visual back. Yeah.
2-part question. You talked about one, a really, really good map versus your telescope. You got a weight percentage that you go for in there, and the second part of it is we started out with bronze gears, then we got into belt drives, got into harmonic drives. What's the next thing on the future?
Yeah, so the question was about mounts, and the first part of it was about weight. And so this telescope, they say it has a payload limit of 11 pounds. This mount has a payload limit of 11 pounds. The same thing with the go-to version of this, which is the GTI. I've tried these right at the payload limit, and you're definitely going to get worse results with a mount this small if you load it up to the limit for imaging. So there's certain mounts, especially smaller mounts, where my advice is just light as possible. If these are really good with this 60 millimeter telescope or a camera lens. Other mounts like this one, the AM5, I don't remember what the payload limit is. Does it 44 pounds?
That's with the weight.
I've tried it up to 40, around there, 41 pounds, and could still get good results. So some of the higher end mounts, I think their payload limits are more accurate for imaging. And I guess it probably has to do with the technology too. The belt drives and the harmonic drives are probably better than the gear-driven drives at really excelling at those higher weights and being more accurate with the payload limit. With the older style of gear-driven drives, I try to keep, the common rule of thumb here is 50% of the payload limit. So if the payload limit was 11 pounds, try to keep it at 5.5 pounds or under. I think you could probably go a little higher than that, but somewhere around there. And then you ask, what's the next type of drive? Probably the direct drive. So I don't know, don't ask me how it works, but there's some mounts coming out that are called direct drive, or a friction drive, or something like that. And I think they don't use any belts or pulleys or anything at all, but I'm not exactly sure how they work. But they're, at this point, they're still quite expensive. But the harmonic drive mount, when it came out with Rainbow Astro and stuff like that, it was very expensive. And so then it took maybe 5 years before more affordable versions of it started coming out. And now I'm hearing about people building their own harmonic drive mounts for under $1,000. So I think that prices get driven down in competition. Yeah.
So when you're talking about cameras, you also got to look at the sensor, the size. Some have square sensors and some have rectangular space. So when you're looking at your camera footage, you're looking at pictures of it. If you're taking Andromeda, if you have a square sensor, you're going to chop everything off. If you have a rectangular sensor, you can tilt it and get the right.
Yes.
So you got to kind of look at that too.
Yeah, the aspect ratio of the sensor,
Yes. Yeah. And the other comment I would make, and we were talking very at the beginning about frustration on doing the stuff. And my mom's here with me, she will tell you I have zero patience for anything in my life except for computers and astrophotography. So that's kind of just interesting. I have zero patience for everything else.
Yes. yeah, that is a weird thing where when you really love it, even though I can sort of objectively say that it's frustrating, nowadays when I'm out in my observatory, things go wrong all the time. And I don't get frustrated. I just like being out there. I actually like fixing things under the night sky, just like tinkering with it. It's not a big deal. Like that new Fast Newtonian I had, like I said, it's 100 emails with that guy, but I don't feel the frustration I did earlier at all. I just feel good about it. Because I guess part of it is knowing I think I can do it now. I think that end goal is attainable and that like it's actually going to happen if I just keep going.
Prior knowledge.
Yeah, for prior knowledge, exactly. I think the really frustrating thing about it as a beginner is not knowing. Just being like, well, there's all these problems, but I don't know how to fix them. And that's where having a group like this and talking to other people is so important, because then your prior knowledge base gets a lot bigger, because you can ask people who've done it before, and they might look at something and immediately know what the problem is because they've already experienced it.
You talk about undersampling. If you have part of pixel size that's way up your ball center, is there a way to just gain and stop that undersampling?
A way to what? Gain it?
Yeah, just the gain.
Oh, adjusting the gain. Oh, the gain isn't really related, but what you can do if you're really undersampled is
If I'm really focused.
oversampled. So your pixels are smaller than.
I've got, like, I'm using my raw time, just with the ball center, I've got a P94 and pixel size on that, so I'm way over.
No, that'd be great undersample. Yeah, so if you're way undersampled, what you want to do is, let me try to explain this as best I can. It's a little technical, but dither and drizzle. And so the drizzle algorithm was invented for the Hubble Space Telescope, because the Hubble Space Telescope was undersampled for what they wanted to achieve. They used very big pixels too. And what it is basically when you're guiding, between every guiding exposure, you tell your telescope to move slightly in a random direction. So you tell it, okay, take the exposure, then move slightly, like 5 pixels this way, then 5 pixels this way, 5 pixels this way, just in a random direction, and it makes a grid, basically. It's just sort of traveling around and it's moving the stars slightly. That's called dithering. It helps with noise too, to dither. But if you want to drizzle, then what you can do is with all those dithered exposures, you can drizzle onto a finer grid of pixels and basically go from something that's way undersampled to something that has much better sampling. And if you, so like let's say you were resolving something that was 2 arc seconds across, like a certain little detail here in the nebula. If you move that object all over the place, and then you take all of that data and you're stacking it, you put it onto a finer grid of pixels when you stack it, you'll actually resolve smaller things. Because by moving it around, it was sort of resolving different parts of it. And then once you sample that onto a finer grid, I don't know if I'm explaining this well enough, that's called the drizzle algorithm, and you'll actually see some improvement in the amount of detail there. So when you're undersampled, I would drizzle, and then after you drizzle, you can also use something called deconvolution, which will make the image even sharper. So in PixInsight, there's a really popular tool called Blur Exterminator, but then there's a free version called, there's 2 free versions, Cosmic Clarity by SETI Astro and Graxford deconvolution. So that combination of things is of dithering, drizzling, and then deconvolution. I find that with undersampled data, you can recover so much of that fine detail.
How's that different than binning? What is binning?
Binning, yeah. So binning was popular when the popular type of astronomy cameras was called a CCD, a charge coupled device. Now we use CMOS sensors, and the way they read out the pixels is different. So binning isn't as popular because it used to be done on the hardware. Well, now binning is something that's basically a software thing. And what binning is like, okay, if you imagine a pixel and it's a grid of little square things, binning would be you make your pixels super pixels. So you make bigger pixels by taking a grid of 2 by 2. And so bin 2 would be 2 by 2 pixels. And the idea is basically you're changing sampling. So if you're way oversampled, your pixels are too fine, you could bin and make them much bigger. The reason it was really popular in the CCD days is that the CCDs weren't as efficient, they weren't as good at converting the light into digital data as the CMOS cameras. So they would bin your RGB data. And so bin 2 on your RGB, bin 1 on your luminance. So you get all the detail of the luminance, and the color would be a lot brighter, you capture more signal by using bigger pixels. And then when you combined all of that, the idea was get the best of both worlds. Better signal on the color channels, better detail on luminance. With CMOS, a lot of that's been thrown out the window because it doesn't have that hardware binning, so you're not getting that kind of advantage of the read, blah, blah, blah. Technical stuff we got with the CCD cameras.
The reason I asked is that I could change the banding on there, so does it really do anything for me unless I have an undermatched?
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend it for your actual images. You might want to use it for things like plate solving or something like that, just because then you can take shorter exposures for plate solving, more signal. So if you were
the bigger the bin, the shorter exposure.
Yeah, shorter exposure. Yeah, so you might use it for those kind of tasks, but for the actual images with CMOS, I wouldn't.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
I've got several projectors, and 3 of them have the crazy adapter. I've got the D-ring for the Nikon camera, and I can't get enough in focus. Do they move the mirror? Do I need to get a corrector of some kind, or
Yeah, so the question was with the Dobsonian mount and a Newtonian telescope on a Dobsonian mount. They designed those telescopes for visual observers, so once you put the DSLR on it, you don't have enough inward focus to reach focus. There's three common solutions. One, for some, they've made a low-profile focuser that you change out the whole focuser, and it might work. The next common solution is change your camera, because the DSLR has that mirror, so the sensor is much further back. If you change to a mirrorless camera, the sensor is much closer to the flange, and you might find you actually do have enough inward focus with a mirrorless or stronger camera. The third solution, if you want to use your DSLR and you just want to buy something, you could buy a Barlow lens. And the Barlow lens pushes the focal plane back, but it also magnifies it, whatever the Barlow effect is, 2 times or whatever. So then that makes imaging more difficult. But when I did that planetary with the manually with the DSLR, I was using a 2 times Barlow. So it increases the difficulty, but it'd be one thing you could buy and you could reach focus with your DSLR.
So are the Newtonians are the ones that you're hooking the camera to, are they dedicated to being?
Yes. Oh, yeah. Good question. So if you see for imaging Newtonian, they're dedicated for astrophotography. You could still probably use them for visual with probably just like an adapter of some kind. What they've done is, just like you said, they've designed it so the primary mirror is already further up in the tube, so that it reaches focus at a different part. I have talked to some people who, they have the Dobsonian and they've actually just like chopped the tube or put it in a different tube to move the mirror up, but you'll know if you want to do that or not, since it's a whole DIY project. All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nico. It is 11:45. Right now, WVA is having a fundraiser, barbecue. So if you'd like to help the organization out, or if you just like really good barbecue, we have pulled pork, some brisket, and all kinds of sides. That will be at cabin number 8. So if you'll go out the parking lot, turn right, go down, go up the hill, it'll be, you can't miss the signs. It's numbered on the right-hand side of the road. Cabin number 8 for everybody's invited to a barbecue. And then we will be back here at, we did a long lunch today, so conference fire up. So that will last until 1:45, and we'll be back here at 2 p.m. And hopefully the clouds will play nice with us, and we will have a solar workshop right out here in the parking lot. So you'll be able to come connect one of our smart scopes or observe visually through a couple solar scopes. So everybody again, let's thank Nico one more time.
Killed it, boy. Killed it. Yeah, buddy. Booyah.